I watched Sabrina Ionescu respond to what initially sounded like a completely ordinary post-game question following New York's loss to Indiana, a game in which the Fever walked away with a 106-92 victory after knocking down 16 three-pointers, and on the surface, the explanation seemed obvious. Indiana caught fire from deep, New York couldn't keep up, and the final box score appeared to tell the entire story, but Ionescu offered a much more revealing explanation. She pointed toward Indiana's interior players and explained that they were difficult to handle, forcing New York's defenders to collapse toward the paint, and once those defenders moved inside, the kick-out opportunities naturally appeared on the perimeter. Suddenly, Indiana's three-point barrage wasn't simply a matter of players getting hot, it was the consequence of a defensive problem that kept presenting itself. Every time a Liberty defender stepped toward the lane, another area of the floor became vulnerable, and Ionescu specifically pointed toward Caitlin Clark as the player capable of recognizing and exploiting those openings. Clark finished with 22 points and 10 assists, but the important part wasn't simply the number of assists. It was the way she controlled the decisions New York had to make throughout the game. Her shooting meant defenders couldn't comfortably back away from her, while her ability to attack the basket forced additional attention, and once that help arrived, she could immediately find the teammate whose defender had just abandoned them. That created a difficult situation for New York. Stay attached to the perimeter and Clark has room to attack. Collapse toward the paint and she can immediately send the ball to an open shooter. Try to pressure her farther away from the basket and the space behind the first defender becomes available. Calling it an impossible defensive situation might sound dramatic, but the geometry of what Ionescu described makes the problem much easier to understand. New York head coach DeMarco acknowledged that the Liberty had deliberately prioritized protecting the paint, but he also admitted that such an approach naturally creates opportunities outside. If the defense commits heavily to stopping penetration and interior scoring, open three-point attempts are going to appear at some point. That doesn't mean New York intentionally wanted Indiana's shooters standing alone around the arc. The larger issue was what happened after the initial defensive decision. The first defender moved toward the paint, another player had to rotate, and then a third defender had to react to the next pass. Indiana repeatedly forced New York to complete that sequence faster than the Liberty could manage. Clark was at the center of those movements. She wasn't simply waiting around the perimeter for someone else to create a shot. She scored 22 points herself, connected on 4 three-pointers, attacked downhill, and repeatedly forced the defense to make decisions before delivering the ball to an open teammate. Her 10 assists show how many of those sequences ended in baskets, but they don't capture every advantage she created before the final pass. They don't record the defender who took an extra step toward Clark, the help defender who moved away from a shooter, or the possessions where her shooting range forced New York to begin defending farther from the basket than it wanted to. And that pressure starts long before Clark actually reaches the rim. Against many point guards, defenders can comfortably retreat underneath a screen and concentrate on protecting the driving lane. With Clark, that strategy becomes dangerous because her shooting range changes how much space a defender can afford to surrender. Push the defender higher and the space behind the screen becomes available. Bring another defender toward the ball and Indiana can quickly create a 4-on-3 situation once Clark moves the ball. New York attempted to compensate by keeping extra bodies closer to the lane, but Indiana responded by moving the ball back outside before the defense could recover. The numbers from the first half show just how quickly that punishment arrived. Indiana connected on 11 of 14 three-point attempts during the opening half, and at one point in the second quarter, the Fever made 7 consecutive shots from beyond the arc. New York was creating the congestion it wanted around the basket, but Indiana was moving the ball out of that congestion faster than the Liberty could rotate back into position. And Clark wasn't responsible for making every one of those shots. That's an important part of the story. Kelsey Mitchell finished with 28 points while shooting 11-4-16 from the field, and she was perfect on all 4 of her three-point attempts. Her movement and quick release meant Clark's passes could become points before New York had enough time to reorganize its defense. Aaliyah Boston added 19 points, 7 rebounds, and 4 assists, and her influence went beyond those statistics because she was one of the interior threats that forced New York to send help toward the paint in the first place. When Boston establishes position inside and draws a defender toward her, the advantage has already been created even before she receives the basketball. Sophie Cunningham and Indiana's other perimeter players then made the situation even more difficult by maintaining spacing around the floor. New York couldn't simply identify one dangerous shooter and decide to live with everyone else because Indiana had multiple players capable of punishing the next rotation. This is also why reducing the entire performance to Clark alone misses an important part of what happened. Clark was the player organizing the pressure, but Indiana's supporting cast made every defensive decision more costly. Without Boston's interior presence, the help defender could stay closer to the perimeter. Without Mitchell knocking down those opportunities, Clark's passes wouldn't have carried the same consequences. And without Indiana's other shooters maintaining their spacing, New York could have rotated toward its preferred defensive target and accepted the lesser threat. On August 11th, the entire sequence worked together. Clark created the initial problem. Boston and Indiana's interior players occupied the attention of the help defenders. Mitchell and the perimeter shooters punished the resulting openings. The final result was 16 made three-pointers in Indiana's 15th game this season, reaching at least 100 points, extending the Fever's own WNBA single-season record. Clark's performance also added another milestone to an already remarkable season. Her 22 points and 10 assists gave her a league-leading 9th game this year with at least 20 points and 10 assists, while the performance represented the 19th such game of her career, the most in WNBA history. Mitchell also extended her streak of games with at least 20 points to 17, establishing another WNBA single-season record. Those accomplishments came from the same basic structure. Clark's scoring ability prevented New York from treating her as a traditional pass-first guard. Mitchell's scoring made it impossible to send all defensive attention toward Clark. Boston's presence inside prevented New York from solving the problem simply by keeping everyone outside. New York essentially had more threats than it had defenders capable of taking them away simultaneously. There is, however, an important qualification to this entire discussion. Indiana shot roughly 64% from three-point range, and that isn't a realistic shooting percentage to expect every night. Making 11 of 14 attempts in the first half involved excellent shot creation, but it also involved an extraordinary level of shot conversion. Ionescu herself raised that issue after the game, essentially questioning whether the result might have looked completely different if Indiana hadn't converted so many of those attempts. That's a fair point. Some of Indiana's shots were difficult. Some came late in the shot clock. Others were simply the kind of attempts that a defense can live with over a larger sample if they aren't consistently falling. A defensive scheme can create an advantage without guaranteeing that the opponent will shoot at an unsustainable percentage. And that's where the distinction becomes important. The real question isn't whether Indiana can shoot 64% from three every night. The real question is whether Caitlin Clark can continue creating the same defensive choices. Those are two very different things. Shooting percentage tells us what happened after the shot was released. Advantage creation tells us what happened before that release. A defender moves toward the paint. That movement opens a passing lane. Clark recognizes the opening. She delivers the ball. Another Indiana player gets the opportunity that the defensive rotation created. New York's own post-game comments support that interpretation. Ionescu talked about Indiana's bigs forcing paint help and Clark being the player who could turn that help into kick-out opportunities. DeMarco confirmed that protecting the paint had been a major part of New York's defensive approach while acknowledging that the rotations behind that decision weren't good enough. That doesn't mean every one of Indiana's 16 threes came from the exact same action. Basketball is far messier than that. Transition possessions, individual shot making, defensive mistakes, broken plays, and difficult attempts all played a role. The system doesn't have to explain every individual basket. It only needs to explain why the same defensive problem continued appearing throughout the game. And if you're trying to determine whether this was simply one unusually hot shooting performance or a genuine recurring problem for opponents, don't start with the 16 made threes. Start with how Indiana created those attempts. A future opponent might hold the Fever well below that 64% mark while still spending the entire game dealing with the same chain reaction: help toward Boston, attention toward the paint, pressure on Clark, a kick-out, and a rapid defensive recovery. That's why I kept thinking about Ionescu's answer instead of simply looking at the final score. She wasn't describing some mysterious night where every Indiana player suddenly became unstoppable. She was effectively describing a list of defensive responsibilities. Deal with the interior threats. Protect the lane. Recover to the perimeter. Respect Clark's shooting range. Prevent her from getting downhill. Then react quickly enough to survive whatever decision she makes with the ball. One possession can require a defense to complete every one of those tasks. And that is an enormous amount of pressure. Dallas now gets the next opportunity to test Indiana on August 14th. The Wings already defeated the Fever 107-104 in the regular season opener on May 9. Clark finished that game with 20 points, 7 assists, 5 rebounds, and 5 turnovers, and her late three-point attempt that could have tied the game failed to fall. That first meeting gives Dallas useful information, but Indiana's offense has developed considerably since then. Clark now has 19 career games featuring at least 20 points and 10 assists. Mitchell enters the matchup riding a streak of 17 consecutive 20-point games, and the Fever have reached the 100-point mark 15 times this season. Dallas doesn't need to eliminate every one of those numbers individually. It needs to disrupt the connection between them. One possible approach would be switching more actions so that the defense doesn't immediately have to send help toward the paint. That could keep defenders closer to shooters, but it could also create size mismatches for Boston or leave Clark facing a slower defender in open space. Another possibility is zone defense. A zone can place additional defenders around driving lanes without necessarily committing a second defender directly to Clark, but it also creates areas that an elite passer can attack, particularly if Indiana moves the ball quickly before the zone has time to organize. Dallas could also pressure Clark farther from the basket and attempt to force the ball out of her hands. But New York's experience shows what has to happen next. Once that pressure forces Clark to move the ball, the defense still has to rotate correctly behind it before Mitchell, Boston, or another Indiana shooter receives the pass. Every defensive adjustment solves one problem while creating another. And there may be no clearer test than August 22nd, when Indiana travels to New York for another meeting with the Liberty. DeMarco will have another opportunity to face the same opponent, the same primary creator, and a complete record of what went wrong during this matchup. He can change the opening coverage. He can move the help defender. He can demand quicker rotations. What he can't do is make the competing threats disappear. If New York again prioritizes protecting the paint, its perimeter rotations will need to happen earlier without giving Clark an easier path through the middle. If the Liberty choose to stay attached to shooters, the initial defender has to find a way to contain Clark without relying on the same help. And if they send 2 defenders toward the ball, the remaining 3 have to somehow account for Boston, Mitchell, and the weak side threats without wasting a single movement. None of that means Clark is impossible to defend. New York has beaten Indiana before. Every offense has possessions where the execution breaks down. Clark will turn the ball over. Shooters will miss. Screens will arrive at the wrong angle. Help defenders will occasionally disguise their coverage well enough to interrupt the read. The real difficulty is the number of correct defensive decisions required on each possession. Indiana needed only one New York decision to be late. If the first defender gave Clark too much room, she could shoot. If the defender crowded her, she could attack. If help arrived, she could make the pass. Then Indiana's teammates had to finish the possession. On August 11th, they did exactly that. Mitchell's 28 points punished defenders who stayed outside. Boston's 19 points punished the defense inside. Clark's 22 points ensured she remained a scoring threat, while her 10 assists showed how often she turned defensive attention into opportunities for somebody else. That balance is much harder to defend than one player simply going on a scoring run. A defense can trap one star and accept the next pass if the other 4 players aren't dangerous enough to punish the rotation. Indiana didn't give New York that luxury. There was no obvious harmless destination for the basketball. The Fever almost certainly won't make 11 of their first 14 three-point attempts every game, and that percentage is the part of the performance most likely to return toward a more normal level. But the defensive sequence behind those attempts can remain. Paint pressure can still pull defenders inward. Clark can still identify the opening. Mitchell can still force defenders to stay attached. Boston can still punish smaller defenders inside. The shots may fall at a more ordinary rate while the defense is still being forced to make an extraordinary number of decisions. Ionescu's post-game response only lasted a few sentences, but those sentences contained the essential ingredients: Indiana's interior threats, New York's help defense, the kick-out passes, Clark's shooting, her ability to attack downhill, and her decision-making. DeMarco added the other side of the equation by explaining that New York had committed to protecting the paint and then failed to rotate quickly enough behind that commitment.